Saddam Hussein Abd al-Majid al-Tikriti, historically known as Saddam Hussein, was born on April 28, 1937, in the small village of Al-Awjar near Tikrit, northwest of Baghdad, Iraq. His father, Hussein Abd al-Majid, a peasant sheep herder, may have abandoned the family before Saddam's birth or passed away from throat cancer around 1936-1937. Hussein belonged to the Albu Nasir tribe, which had migrated from Yemen to Iraq generations earlier. Saddam's mother, Suba Tulfa al-Musallat, had a more esteemed lineage, tracing back to Talfa ibn Musallat, a descendant of Emir Omar Bey III of Tikrit. Before Saddam's birth, Subha had another son who died before 1937. She later remarried Ibrahim al-Hassan Muhammad, and Saddam had several half-siblings through this union. However, he had limited interaction with them. Saddam's troubled youth was marked by a difficult family background, with a stern stepfather who physically disciplined him. As a child, Saddam left home and lived with an uncle in Baghdad. Saddam grew up during a transformative period in the Middle East, witnessing the decline of Ottoman and Persian rule. Following World War I, Britain and France divided the region into mandates, creating new nations with little regard for regional differences. Iraq gained nominal independence in 1932, but British influence, especially over its oil fields through the Iraqi Petroleum Company, persisted. Saddam's early years coincided with political upheavals, including Iraq's involvement in World War II and the emergence of the Ba'ath Party in 1947, spreading to Iraq in 1951. The Ba'ath Party, associated with Sunni Islam, focused on pan-Arabism and anti-imperialism, rejecting religious dominance in the region. Understanding Saddam's rise and Iraq's politics in the latter half of the 20th century requires examining the Ba'ath Party's influence. Ba'athism advocated for Muslim states in the Middle East to cast off the remnants of imperialism and collaborate to restore Arab prominence, reminiscent of the powerful Muslim empires of earlier centuries. The Ba'ath Party in Iraq opposed the post-mandate governments, setting it against the Iraqi monarchy and government after World War II. Saddam joined the Iraqi Ba'ath Party in 1957 at the age of 20, when it was a relatively small movement. In the mid-1950s, Iraq faced political dissent due to King Faisal II's incompetence, drawing parallels to Egypt's 1952 revolution against King Farouk. The Iraqi Revolution of July 14, 1958, mirrored Egypt's transformation. Military commanders, including Abdul Salam Arif and Abd al-Karim Qasim, orchestrated a coup, overthrowing King Faisal II and establishing a new Iraqi republic. Despite its size, the Ba'ath Party had enough influence to be part of forming the new government. The post-coup government was unstable, with various factions vying for power. The Iraqi Communist Party emerged as a rival to the Ba'ath Party, and Army Commander Qasim resisted joining the United Arab Republic, a pan-Arabism instrument. Angered by Qasim's stance, the Ba'athists plotted to assassinate him, with Saddam chosen as one of the assassins. The attempt on October 7, 1959, failed, speculatively due to Saddam firing too early. In the aftermath, Saddam and others fled to Syria, joining the Syrian branch of the Ba'ath Party. Saddam temporarily relocated to Egypt, continuing law studies at the University of Cairo. In 1963, he witnessed coups in Syria and Iraq, resulting in the establishment of Ba'athist regimes in both countries. Hafez al-Assad, involved in the Syrian coup, later rose to rule Syria. Weeks earlier, the Ramadan Revolution in Iraq, led by Ba'athists within the army, ousted Qasim's government and seized power. The Ba'athists held power for only 9 months before one of Qasim's former allies, Abdul Salim Arif, seized control in Baghdad and purged them from the government. Following the November 1963 coup and Ba'athist purges, Saddam returned to Iraq and continued operating in the capital with remaining party members. Arrested in 1964 for involvement with a prohibited political party, he was sentenced to jail for several years. Implicated in a plot to kill Arif, he was imprisoned again in October 1964, but escaped after 2 years. Nearing his 30th year, Saddam began rising within the Iraqi Ba'athist movement after his escape. Appointed as a regional commander, he proved to be an effective organizer during a period of internal divisions over ties with the Soviet Union and other Marxist-Leninist states. By this time, Saddam was married to Sajida Talfa, his first cousin, and had children. The 17th of July revolution in 1968 marked the beginning of Saddam's political ascent. With the Ba'athists seizing complete control of the Iraqi state, Saddam played a crucial role in purging the movement of dissenting figures. Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam's cousin, led the new government, and Saddam was appointed vice president of the Republic of Iraq. Over the next decade, Saddam became indispensable in governing Iraq. He oversaw economic reforms, transforming the country into one of the richest in the Middle East, largely based on its vast oil reserves. Although Iraq's oil industry was initially controlled by Western interests, Saddam's administration gradually asserted control, shifting the economic landscape. In the early 1970s, Saddam aggressively nationalized companies, capitalizing on the 1973 energy crisis, when oil prices surged due to Middle East oil sellers limiting supplies to Western states that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. With oil revenue flowing into Iraq, the Ba'athists, under Saddam's oversight, initiated modernization and ambitious social policies, elevating Iraq to the nation, with the best standard of living among Muslim countries in the Middle East. Saddam led an education campaign, significantly increasing literacy, and established a system of universal basic healthcare, earning recognition from UNESCO. To secure Iraq's long-term economic stability, Saddam used oil profits to develop new businesses and modern infrastructure, diversifying the economy. He focused on mechanizing the agriculture sector and replacing outdated farming methods. Despite initial socialist leanings, Iraq's foreign policy shifted as Hussein sought closer ties with the Soviet Union. In 1972, a 15-year pact with the Soviet Union was signed. In response, the US began aiding Kurds in northern Iraq, leading to the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War in 1974. Saddam managed to suppress Kurdish unrest through the Algiers Accords in 1975, mediated by Houari Boumediene. Iran agreed to stop aiding the Kurds in exchange for a territorial concession. The latter half of the 1970s saw Saddam's rise to unprecedented strength in Iraq. By 1976, he was promoted to the rank of general in the Iraqi army. Suspecting Saddam's ambition for absolute power, President al-Bakr negotiated a political union with Syria in the late 1970s, where al-Bakr would serve as the senior ruler until his death or retirement, succeeded by Syria's President Hafez al-Assad. This arrangement would have excluded Saddam from succeeding as the next ruler of Iraq once al-Bakr stepped down. On July 16, 1979, Saddam Hussein orchestrated a bloodless coup, prompting President al-Bakr's resignation and allowing him to assume the role of head of state. Within 6 days, Saddam initiated a comprehensive purge within the Ba'athist party, aiming to eliminate opponents and potential rivals. He accused a fifth column from the Ba'athist Party of Syria of plotting against Iraq during a meeting at Al-Khuld Hall in Baghdad. Muhi Abdel Hussein's confession implicated 68 individuals, leading to their detention. A special criminal court conducted show trials over the next 2 weeks. During these trials, 21 individuals were executed, and others were forcibly removed from their positions. This purge not only solidified Saddam's power, but also led to a significant breakdown in diplomatic relations between the Ba'athists of Iraq and Syria. The summer of 1979 marked a pivotal moment, setting the tone for Saddam's prolonged rule characterized by authoritarianism and brutality. Despite the positive reforms introduced in the 1970s, Saddam's leadership in the 1980s took a darker turn. Paramilitary organizations such as the Iraqi Popular Army and secret police bodies like the Mujhabarat, or Iraqi Intelligence Service, were instrumental in initiating a reign of terror. This reign involved widespread surveillance of society for political dissidents, active persecution of groups such as the Kurds and radical Shia Muslims, and the illegal arrest, detention, and torture of tens of thousands of Iraqis suspected of opposing the regime. The Mukhabarat, during the 1980s, even executed Iraqi political exiles in various countries, showcasing the extent of Saddam's tyrannical rule. As his authoritarianism intensified, Saddam cultivated a cult of leadership in the 1980s. Drawing parallels to Nebuchadnezzar, the great king of ancient Babylon, he went to the extent of having archaeological sites stamped with his name. Statues dedicated to Saddam proliferated throughout Iraq, and his image became omnipresent in society, from currency to murals on buildings. Staged national elections, held in 1995 and 2002, further reinforced his dominance, with Saddam purportedly receiving nearly 100% of the vote. This meticulous consolidation of power, combined with brutal actions by the secret police and other state services, ensured Saddam's unyielding control over Iraq from 1979 onwards. Even as the economy deteriorated due to declining oil revenues and prolonged conflict with Iran, Saddam Hussein remained a formidable force until 2003. During the first half of Saddam Hussein's reign, the dominant and defining feature was the prolonged conflict with Iraq's eastern neighbor, Iran. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, which ousted the Shah and brought Ruhollah Khomeini to power, transformed Iran into a theocracy dominated by Shia Muslims. This posed a significant challenge to Saddam and the Ba'ath Party, who were largely Sunni Muslims in a country with a Shia majority. Concerns arose that Khomeini might attempt to spread Islamist ideology into Iraq, undermining the Ba'athist regime's secular aspirations. In September 1980, Saddam, confident of Western support, initiated hostilities, marking the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, an 8-year-long and immensely bloody conflict. The Ba'athist regime expected Western aid, particularly from the United States, which aimed to counter or reverse the Iranian Revolution. The war initially focused on border conflicts, with Iraq invading western Iran in late 1980. However, the situation shifted, and by 1982, Saddam sought peace negotiations as the expected quick victory turned into a protracted war of attrition. Iran, with military advancements, countered Iraq's initial aggression and even extended the war onto Iraqi soil, nearly capturing Basra in the mid-1980s. Tactical developments occurred as Saddam expanded the military draft and received increased aid from foreign powers. In 1985, Iraq launched a fresh offensive, stalling as in previous attempts, followed by an Iranian counteroffensive that saw the capture of Al-Faw in 1986. Despite these events, neither side could secure a decisive advantage, leading to a prolonged stalemate. Two notable aspects of the Iran-Iraq War have garnered attention. Firstly, Saddam and the Ba'athists received support from Western governments, notably the United States. While not allies, the US saw Iraq as a counterbalance to the perceived threat from Iran and provided financial aid and war materials to prevent Iranian dominance. The second infamous aspect was the use of chemical weapons by Iraq, including mustard gas and sarin, particularly in situations where it faced existential threats from Iranian advances. Conversely, Iran's widespread use of child soldiers resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of teenagers on the battlefield. Eventually, the war concluded in 1988. Although Iran had initially held the upper hand, its resources and manpower were depleted, making it unlikely to deliver a decisive blow to Iraq. In 1988, Saddam issued a warning to Tehran, threatening a new bombing campaign and widespread use of chemical weapons if Iran refused to enter talks. After the Iran-Iraq War concluded in August 1988, peace negotiations between Iraq and Iran were prompted, partly influenced by the US shooting down an Iranian civilian airliner in July 1988, raising concerns in Tehran about potential direct US involvement. Peace terms were agreed upon, officially ending the nearly 8-year-long war that resulted in approximately 1 million deaths. However, the end of the Iran-Iraq War did not usher in a sustained period of peace for Iraq. In the closing stages of the war, Saddam Hussein initiated a campaign of genocide against the Kurdish minority in northern Iraq. The Kurds, despite their significant population and territorial presence in the Middle East, have historically faced persecution from governments in Iraq and Turkey. In early 1988, as the conflict with Iran was concluding, Saddam ordered Iraqi troops into northern Iraq to counter the Kurdish insurgency. The Al-Anfal campaign, lasting from February to late autumn 1988, resulted in the deaths of between 50,000 and 100,000 Kurds, with many more displaced, deported, or subjected to forced Arabization. This brutal campaign amounted to genocide against the Kurds. Saddam's actions soon drew the opposition of his reluctant allies from the Iran-Iraq War, the United States, and other Western powers. During the war, Iraq had borrowed billions from Kuwait, a small but oil-rich Gulf state. Saddam, facing an inability to repay this debt and aggravated by Kuwait's actions within OPEC, invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990. The invasion, largely one-sided, quickly led to Kuwait falling under Iraqi control. with Saddam declaring it the 19th province of Iraq. Saddam's miscalculation was apparent, as he believed his Western allies would not react strongly, viewing him as a counterbalance against Iran. However, the United States and its allies responded swiftly, imposing economic and diplomatic sanctions on Iraq. A naval blockade of the Persian Gulf followed, severely impacting Iraq's oil-dependent economy and military capacity. Diplomatic tensions were further heightened by the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who influenced the US President George Bush to take a firm stance against Saddam. Saddam, seeking leverage, proposed withdrawing from Kuwait if other Middle East territorial issues, such as the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, were simultaneously addressed, a proposal unlikely to gain acceptance from Washington. The aftermath of Saddam Hussein's ill-fated invasion of Kuwait in 1990 ushered in a new era for Iraq. While Saddam survived the Gulf War and retained his grip on power throughout the 1990s, the country faced severe international sanctions. These sanctions, imposed by the global community, targeted Iraq's economy, particularly its oil exports. The economic repercussions, compounded by the embargo on Iraqi oil led by the United States, left Iraq in dire straits. The economy, heavily reliant on oil exports, struggled, and living conditions for the Iraqi population deteriorated. In 1996, an oil-for-food program was initiated to alleviate the economic challenges faced by Iraq. However, the impact was limited, and Iraq remained constrained in its ability to import and export goods. The sanctions took a toll on various aspects of Iraqi society, including average salaries and child mortality rates, which fell below mid-20th century levels. Despite the economic hardships faced by the nation, Saddam Hussein found himself more entrenched in power. The US and its allies, having halted their military campaign after liberating Kuwait, signaled a reluctance to pursue regime change in Iraq. Additionally, Saddam no longer faced immediate threats from neighboring countries. The lesson learned from the failed Kuwait invasion led to a shift in focus. Instead of pursuing further military endeavors, Saddam concentrated on consolidating power domestically. During the 1990s, Saddam's regime also witnessed a shift towards a more religious dictatorship. While the Ba'ath Party had initially championed secularism, the 1990s saw an effort to utilize Islam as a tool to enforce a more authoritarian rule. This move coincided with a rising tide of religious extremism across the Middle East. Saddam Hussein's ability to adapt and maintain control amid economic hardships and international isolation characterized Iraq in the aftermath of the Gulf War. The subsequent decades would bring further challenges, including the US-led invasion in 2003 and the eventual downfall of Saddam Hussein's regime. The 1990s marked a tumultuous period for Iraq as the nation faced economic decline and internal strife under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. As the country transformed into a mere shadow of its earlier aspirations from the 1960s and 1970s, the Hussein family's grip on power tightened. Notably, Saddam's two sons from his first marriage, Uday and Qusay, played significant roles in shaping Iraq's trajectory. Qusay, the younger brother, emerged as a key figure and potential successor to Saddam. Leading the Republican Guard, he crushed a Shiite Muslim uprising in southern Iraq after the Gulf War. His actions extended to initiating a calamitous environmental disaster by flooding the historic marshlands, disrupting the traditional lifestyle of Shiite Arabs. While Qusay's actions were problematic, they paled in comparison to the notorious behavior of his older brother, Uday. Infamous for his alcoholism, rape, murder, and psychopathy, Uday hosted sadistic parties in Baghdad. Reports suggested he tortured members of the Iraqi football team for losing matches. By the mid-1990s, his erratic behavior escalated, leading some family members to defect to Jordan out of fear for their lives. Uday's reign of terror included allegations of torture against his own employees and engaging in serial rape throughout Baghdad. A failed assassination attempt in 1996 left him partially disabled but failed to curb his extreme conduct. Despite evidence that Saddam was aware of Uday's actions in the late 1980s, he took little action to regulate his behavior, allowing Uday to inflict horrors upon the people of Baghdad. In an unexpected turn, Saddam Hussein, often associated with oppressive rule and military aggression, displayed a different side in the early 2000s. During these years, he wrote 4 novels and several poems, some with the assistance of ghostwriters. The novels, including Sabida and the King, and Men and the City, explored historical allegories related to Iraq's past. Sabita and the King was seen as an allegory of Iraq's alleged destruction by the US-led sanctions after the Gulf War. The decline of Iraq's living standards in the 1990s and early 2000s was influenced by Western sanctions restricting the import economy. The Hussein regime's failure to be transparent about its weapons of mass destruction efforts further exacerbated the situation. Saddam's imaginings of the US as a destabilizing force in Iraq were not entirely unfounded, as both internal and external factors contributed to the nation's hardships during this period. The imposition of economic and political sanctions on Iraq after the First Gulf War was contingent on Saddam Hussein's compliance with disarmament. In 1991, Iraq relinquished its chemical weapons, but suspicions lingered about efforts to develop new weapons, including biological and chemical agents such as mustard gas, sarin gas, and anthrax. UN inspections in the mid-1990s revealed production and likely testing of such compounds, notably on prisoners from Abu Ghraib prison. Despite subsequent inspections indicating a lack of effective deployment capabilities, Saddam's regime became uncooperative with UN inspectors after 1998. The pivotal issue regarding Saddam's intentions to develop nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons in the 1990s and early 2000s would later lead to the end of his regime. In the aftermath of the September 11, 2001, attacks by Al-Qaeda, the U.S., under President George W. Bush, initiated the War on Terror. While the invasion of Afghanistan was justifiable due to Al-Qaeda's presence, attention shifted to Iraq, driven by the unfounded belief that Saddam was close to acquiring nuclear weapons. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, also known as the Second Gulf War, commenced in the spring of 2003. The military intervention was initially successful, lasting only a few weeks. A joint U.S.-British force, with support from some allies but condemnation from others, swiftly invaded Iraq. The shock and awe bombing campaign preceded the ground invasion, which witnessed the collapse of Iraq's armed forces when faced with the overwhelming might of the coalition. Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003, as U.S. and allied troops advanced into southern Iraq. Saddam and his government fled the capital, making a final stand in the Tikrit region, Saddam's homeland. By mid-April, Tikrit fell to the coalition forces, marking the end of Saddam Hussein's quarter-century rule in Iraq. On May 1st, a mere 6 weeks after the campaign's initiation, President George W. Bush visited Iraq and prematurely declared an end to major combat, announcing victory. However, the ensuing U.S. and British military occupation of Iraq stirred up political and religious discontent, leading to sustained unrest. As Allied forces advanced towards Baghdad, Saddam, his family, and key Ba'athist regime figures fled the capital, prompting the U.S. Army to distribute playing cards featuring images of the 52 most wanted Iraqis. Uday and Qusay, Saddam's sons, were located and killed on April 9, 2003, in Mosul, as they attempted to cross into Syria. Saddam remained elusive for over half a year, eventually captured on December 13, 2003, during Operation Red Dawn. Pulled from a makeshift hideout in a disheveled state, he faced a humiliating end. 4 days before his capture, the U.S. occupation government established the Iraqi Special Tribunal to prosecute individuals involved in crimes against humanity and the attempted genocide of Kurds. Saddam was transferred to Camp Cropper in Baghdad, where he awaited trial with other senior Ba'athists for over a year and a half. His trial finally began on October 19, 2005, but he refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, leading to non-cooperation and allegations of torture. Despite objections, he was found guilty on November 6, 2006, for crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. Saddam's legal team filed an appeal, but it was rejected, and an execution order was issued within 30 days. His last days were marked by unusual activities, including eating muffins, listening to music, and tending to a small garden plot. On December 30, 2006, Saddam was executed by hanging at Camp Justice in Baghdad. His final meal included chicken and rice, and his body was returned to Tikrit for burial in a family plot. The event led to celebrations in certain sections of the Iraqi populace. Despite hopes within the U.S. administration that Saddam's execution and the dismantling of the Ba'athist regime would lead to a democratic transformation in Iraq, the country descended into anarchy. A caretaker government was established in June 2004, and the first parliamentary elections were held in January 2005. However, civil war erupted, with militias led by figures like Muqtada al-Sadr establishing control across the country, including parts of Baghdad. Attacks on U.S. military personnel were widespread, necessitating the creation of a heavily fortified green zone in Baghdad. By 2006, U.S. Army personnel reported losing control over parts of the country. A troop surge in 2007 revitalized the American position, but Iraq was never transformed as envisioned in 2003. As the U.S. gradually withdrew from Iraq in 2011, the country faced insurrections and instability. The Islamic State gained control over large parts of the north in the mid-2010s, and political unrest continued into the early 2020s. Saddam's absence did not bring the anticipated stability. Saddam Hussein, a prominent figure in the 20th century, ascended to power with a focus on consolidating authority rather than adhering to a specific ideology. His tenure brought forth significant challenges, notably the Iraq-Iran war with its devastating consequences, including the unsettling use of chemical weapons. The Kurdish population suffered greatly under his rule, and the invasion of Kuwait led to severe international repercussions, impacting the lives of countless Iraqis through sanctions. In his later years, Saddam's leadership took a despotic turn, mirrored by the oppressive actions of his sons. While opinions on the motives behind the 2003 invasion vary, it indisputably marked the end of his regime, a regime marred by both impactful stabilizing efforts and regrettable atrocities.